Hello and welcome to Reporters here on France 24. In this edition, we bring you a report to commemorate the end of World War I, where 100 years ago, after many months of fighting, a battle was launched to prevent any victory by Germany and its allies. 100 years later, and very little is known about the front that stretches from the north of Greece to the south of Macedonia. Now, on the 15th of September 1918, an offensive was launched by Allied powers to ensure defeat became impossible. The idea to have another front didn't go down well in Allied capitals, as it was too far from the French border. Nevertheless, some 63,000 soldiers used the front to pave the way for an Allied victory from the middle of a mountain. Laurent Rouy reports.
It was here, in these mountains in the north of Greece, on the little-known Salonica Front, that the decisive last moves of the First World War were made. The Allied plans, prepared in great secrecy, caught the Central Powers off guard and cut the Bulgarian lines in two.
This was the only breakthrough of World War I. It was clearly the beginning of the end for the Central Powers.
Taken by surprise, the Bulgarian army abandoned strategic towns and capitulated 2 weeks later, the first domino to fall. Within 45 days, support for Germany had evaporated. On November 11, they signed an armistice. The First World War was over. The French saw the First World War as fought mainly on their soil, but for the Central Powers, the battles in the east and south were no less important. Germany wanted to build a railway from Berlin to Baghdad. At stake were the oil fields of Mesopotamia. But first, Serbia had to be conquered. Germany's Austro-Hungarian allies captured Belgrade, the Serbian capital, at the end of 1914, but were quickly forced to retreat. The Central Powers also needed Bulgaria as an ally.
The position of Bulgaria was strategic. If the country entered the war side by side with the Central Powers, they would gain territorial continuity. Germany, Austro-Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey, who fought the Entente, formed one bloc.
In the Balkans, tiny Serbia resisted, stopping the mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the Dardanelles, Ottoman Turkey held the Allies at bay. The Central Powers seemed invincible. Bulgaria chose to join forces with them while, in the Mediterranean, French and British troops were being evacuated. In Paris, politicians and military chiefs dithered over where to redeploy these troops. French military commanders needed men in France, but the government had other ideas.
Should they be left in the east somewhere to create a pressure, a situation that would force the Germans to send troops from the Russian and French fronts? Aristide Briand in the political sphere promoted the idea of staying in the east, but he had enemies, of course, and especially Clemenceau. Clemenceau took it very personally. Briand was a punching bag of his. If I may say so, Clemenceau certainly refused this idea of an eastern front, like many others, because the victory had to be won by the French people on their soil.
Clemenceau was still in the opposition, and Briand, as a member of government, carried the day. But the High Command released only 3 divisions and no artillery.
On the 5th of October 1915, the 156th French Division landed in Salonika, around 10,000 men. It was soon to be joined by a 2nd Division from Alsace, the 57th Division. They were there to support the Serbian army.
This front now needed a commander-in-chief. General Sarai was chosen, dubbed by the press as the savior of Verdun, because in 1914 he had helped prevent the city from falling into German hands. Sarai had many enemies on the right wing, but also had enemies on the left wing, and especially in what was known as the extreme left wing. And one of the main leaders of the extreme left wing at the time was Clemenceau.
Austro-Hungarians, Germans and Bulgarians gave the Allies no respite. On October 5th, the Serbian troops were surrounded and forced to retreat to the coast, evacuated from their own land. From there, French and Italian naval boats took them to Corfu.
The retreat caused the deaths of a large number of soldiers, not only in combat, but during this long march through Montenegro and Albania. There were no roads, no food. 150,000 of them reached the island of Corfu, but the soldiers were so weak and ill that another 5,000 died. Their bodies were handed over to the sea.
For General Sarai, Salonika was a headache. The Greek king Constantine, brother-in-law of the German emperor, was openly pro-German and proclaimed Greek neutrality. In Salonika, diplomats from the Central Powers were spying on the Allies. Adding insult to injury, the French troops were forced to camp in swamplands. More of them died from mosquitoes and disease than from battle. But Sarai did not budge.
It was important to stay in the region and not to give the enemy two victories, a victory in Turkey and a victory in Greece. So it was decided to stay in Salonika. 3 French divisions would fortify the city. They would build immense defences with concrete, sheets of metal and other material brought in from France. Work would start in December 1915 and the entrenched camp would be completed by May 1916.
But supplying the Salonika troops was difficult. Sarai ordered them to grow crops. Clemenceau complained that there were no troops in Salonika, only gardeners. His newspaper launched a campaign. The Salonica Front was also mocked in London. For the British, it was a sideshow, a trivial battle, and they wanted to evacuate Salonika. Sarai was also up against Italian ambitions.
French-British rivalry went on during the war, especially overseas. Palestine, Mesopotamia, Syria were the core of their war goals. They were much less interested in the Balkans. They would agree to leave the Balkans to the French if they were left to operate free further to the east. The Italians openly said they intended to transform the Adriatic Sea into an Italian lake when the war ended, and to eliminate Austro-Hungary from the region. That's why they were keen to fight on the Salonica Front, so they could have their say.
By the summer of 1916, the Serbian army was back on its feet. They returned to reinforce the dwindling numbers on the Salonika Front. France offered new weapons for the dream of liberating their country. In the autumn, the Serbs captured Mount Kajmakčalan from the Bulgarians. At 2,600 meters, it was strategically important. But the human cost was terrible.
Bulgaria wanted to keep the position at any cost. The Serbs wanted it badly. As the fighting went on, the fervor of each was more and more obvious. The fighting was so desperate that French artillery officers attacked together with the Serbs to finally storm the position.
The victory on Kajmakčalan re-established the Allies in Serbia. After the capture of the strategic city of Monastir, the Allies knew that by attacking the high ground, they could force the enemy to withdraw from the valleys. But with the Salonika army now weakened, there would be no victories in 1917.
General Sare knew that the Salonica Front was a secondary front for the Allies. The main front was the French front, the scene in 1916 of the battles of Verdun and the Somme. And this needed vast resources in terms of men and weapons. So, put very simply, there were not enough men and equipment for the secondary Salonica Front.
1917 was a year of political upheaval in France. Clemenceau took control of the government in November. In December, he sacked Sarai, replacing him with General Adolphe Guillaumat, who had orders to prepare the retreat from the Salonica Front. Disgraced, Sarai was dropped from active army service. But once on the ground, Guillaumat changed his mind. It is possible to mount a victorious offensive in the east, he wrote to Clemenceau. He drafted a plan of attack, but before he could implement it, the Germans launched the Third Ludendorff Offensive. Paris was under threat. Guillaumat was recalled urgently. His successor, Louis Franchet d'Espèrey, landed in Salonika on June 18, 1918. Convinced a breakthrough was possible, he further developed his predecessor's plans. 13,000 soldiers of the Eastern Army, together with civilians and prisoners, were put to work building roads and deploying artillery in the mountains. But Franchet d'Espèrey needed a green light from the Allies to attack. He was to win massive support.
Guillaumat played along. He did the job in France, while Franchet played his part on the Eastern Front. The question was not only to convince the British in Salonika, but of course to convince their political chief, Lloyd George, as well.
On September the 4th, Prime Minister David Lloyd George agreed, followed a few days later by the Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. On September the 10th, Clemenceau gave France his assent. By September 12, the last cannons were in place. On the 15th, the attack began. The Bulgarians called desperately for reinforcements. The Germans, fearing a diversionary tactic, refused. Now nothing could stop the Allied advance.
20,000 men, 20,000 Frenchmen found themselves with the Serbs on this ridge and attacked in the early morning at 5:30 and won one of the most beautiful victories in history.
At 22:30, after very fierce fighting, the trenches were taken.
This allowed the Bulgarian front to be broken. It had been blocked for 3 years. And right after, the French Eastern Army and the Serb troops went in.
The Timok and Yugoslav divisions rushed into the breach. They managed between the 16th and the morning of the 17th, fighting at night, to knock over the second Bulgarian defense line. It was necessary to beat the Bulgarian by maneuvers, not combat, to advance to the limit of strength of the men and horses.
A cavalry brigade pincered in behind the infantry and rode for the capital of Skub. It encircled the town in a cavalry charge. It was the French army's last cavalry charge on September 29th at 5 a.m. and captured the 11th German army. 77,000 prisoners. They surrendered to 2,000 cavalry troops. They didn't know there were only 2,000 cavalry. It was a surprise. And the day after, Bulgaria surrendered.
Bulgaria signed the first armistice of the war. Ludendorff, the head of the German army, told the Kaiser that the situation was hopeless. The Allied advance in the east was irresistible. The Ottomans signed the second armistice on October the 30th, and on November the 3rd, the Austrians signed the third.
The Eastern Offensive was a quick success, the kind that had not been seen in the West. This was the only true break in the front line. Even if in the West it had begun to crack since July, it was far slower, and Franchet sent telegrams to Paris saying, "Listen, I believe we have the solution to the war. It's as simple as that. Not only the war in the East, but the war, period. We can go on at this pace to Budapest, Vienna and Munich." For political reasons, Clemenceau was not in favor of this solution. For political reasons, he believed the war had to be won on French soil.
Their backs to the wall, the Germans finally signed the fourth armistice on November 11. In France, the troops were demobilized. But the French Army of the East had a new mission containing the Bolsheviks in Ukraine. Only after mutinies in the spring of 1919 would the Eastern troops be sent home.
The sacrifice of our 65,000 men who died here on the Salonica Front was, of course, honoured. But it wasn't ever in the spotlight, it was always in the background. Yet they were the ones who won first, and they were the ones who brought a speedier end to World War I.
At the Victory Parade on July 14, Franchet d'Esprit stood behind the generals of the French front. Maurice Sarrail watched the parade as a civilian. In the 1920s, the government hailed the sacrifices of the French front, but people wanted to forget the war. Away from the spotlight, the events of the Salonica Front faded slowly from memory.
That's it for this edition of Reporters. Until next week, thank you very much for watching.